After presenting their case that it is objectively immoral to choose abortion, Lee and George address two objections. The first objection, the no-person objection, has two versions, the dualist version and the evaluative version. According to Lee and George, the dualist no-person argument makes the following claims. First, human embryos are human beings. Second, human embryos, though human beings, are not persons. And third, although it is wrong to kill persons, quote, it is not always wrong to kill human beings who are not persons, end quote. Next, Lee and George expand the three claims. Regarding the first and second claims, they explain that some proponents of the dualist no-person argument argue that embryonic human beings are not persons because they do not exercise higher mental functions or capacities. Furthermore, they explain that a subset of these proponents argue specifically that an entity must be self-aware in order to be a person, leading them to conclude that since embryonic human beings are not self-aware, embryonic human beings are not persons. Regarding the third claim, Lee and George explain that proponents of the dualist no-person argument argue that where the line is drawn between entities that are the subjects of rights and those that are not the subjects of rights is when that entity becomes a person. Lee and George respond that this objection relies on the false premise that human persons are something other than physical organisms. Proponents of the dualist no-person argument rely on the view that human persons are either 1. A higher mental function or capacity, like consciousness, or 2. An entity that exhibits higher mental functions or capacities, like consciousness, which uses or is somehow associated with a body. As a result, proponents of the dualist no-person objection argue that though human organisms come into existence at conception, you or I, the human person, are a different thing that comes into existence when higher mental functions or capacities such as consciousness develop. Lee and George deny this premise and instead argue that, quote, we human persons are particular kinds of physical organisms, end quote. Lee and George claim, quote, if a living thing performs bodily actions, then it is a physical organism, end quote. They acknowledge that those who deny that we are physical organisms think of themselves, what they refer to when using the personal pronouns I and you, as the subjects of self-conscious, non-physical actions, like thinking and willing. In other words, those who deny that we are physical organisms do so because when they introspect and consider what they are, they do not recognize themselves as physical organisms. Rather, they recognize themselves as a non-physical self, which, though it resides in a physical organism, only does non-physical things, like thinking and willing. However, Lee and George then argue that what their proponents think of as themselves, the I, or non-physical self we recognize when we introspect, is identical to the subject of bodily actions. For example, Lee and George argue that the thing that understands, the self, and the thing that sees, its body, make up the same entity. All of this considered, Lee and George conclude that since the subject of self-conscious non-physical actions, the I, or non-physical self, is identical to the thing that performs bodily actions, and the performance of bodily actions by a living thing means it is a physical organism, then the entity we are, what we refer to when we say I or you, must essentially be a physical organism with some non-physical capacities. Pulling from these points, Lee and George draw several more conclusions. First, since we are essentially physical organisms, and human organisms come into existence at conception, we come into existence at conception as embryos. Second, since what we normally mean by person is the entity we refer to when using the personal pronouns I and you, then a person is a human organism and an individual with the natural capacity to reason and make free choices. Importantly, this means that a person comes into existence when the human organism comes into existence, despite taking months and years for them to actualize their natural intellectual and decisional capacities they possess only in root form from their conception. And third, saying that the human organism comes into existence at one point and then the human person comes into existence at another makes no sense. Killing human organisms at the early stages of their lives is killing persons.